Hello everyone, welcome to the next lecture of the Silk Road Chapters project. And today we talk about the man about whom, even if you're not interested in history, you definitely heard of. UNESCO even made him the man of the millennia. It's of course Genghis Khan. So he and his offsprings, they once formed a state which included 1/5 of the world population. And we will talk about this man, his descendants, and how their legacy shaped and impacted on the history of Central Asia. So who was Genghis Khan? Genghis Khan, it's not his real name. His real name is Temujin. An interesting fact that his father has named him after one of his enemies. Sounds strange, but actually it was a typical thing among Mongols to name their children after their enemies, whom they respected and also treated as equals. So that's how Genghis Khan got quite an unusual name for his tribe. The name of his tribe was Borjigin, and it was not the tribe of the kings and rulers. The childhood of Genghis Khan was quite difficult. His father died when he was only 10, and being only 10, Genghis Khan all of a sudden became the head of his tribe. So he had to think and take care about his family, his mother, brother, and sisters. And as far as they didn't have any support from their tribe, they had to roam around by themselves, fishing and hunting. So Genghis Khan experienced a hard life from the very beginning, and that's probably became one of his motivation in life. He wanted to have a better life and reach some high position in his society. Genghis Khan spent the majority of his young life in the military campaigns, but let's make it clear, in the military campaigns in the form of battles and fighting between the tribes, not between the states. Finally, Genghis Khan, who was quite talented, he managed to unite a lot of tribes, and in 1206 he was proclaimed to be Genghis Khan, the head of that tribes, and no one called him Temujin since that time. And there are actually a lot of different versions what in reality the name Genghis Khan means. Well, Khan, yes, it's obvious, it means ruler, but Chinggis, Dengis, Tengiz, it can mean strong, big, endless as ocean, but anyway, in the whole world he is famous as Genghis Khan. That was the start of the huge Mongol Empire. At the beginning, of course, it wasn't huge, but it consisted of several tribes united by Genghis Khan. At first, don't think that if they were nomads, that they didn't have any rules or laws which they followed. On the contrary, their life was based on the system which was called Yassa, which was like a pile of laws which were talking about how to collect the taxes, how to divide the loot, how to organize the army, and so on. That's why I don't think that Mongols didn't know anything about the arrangement of state, city, or army. Even more, the word Arda, which usually in Western languages means some like group of nomadic people, nomadic barbarians who just roam to and fro. On the contrary, the word Arda is the same word as Ordnung in German or order in English. That's why the life of nomadic people, it was based on the strict laws and rules. Even more, that was the vision of Genghis Khan. He wanted to create a huge empire where there will be universal laws which would control the whole state. The beginning of the 13th century in Central Asia, it was the time of Khwarazm Shahs. You can hear the part Khwarezm in this name, and you already know that it belongs to the western part of Central Asia, but actually at its peak in the beginning of 13th century, the empire of Khwarazm Shahs, it also included not just Uzbekistan, but also Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and also it was a quite a young dynasty. By the time that Genghis Khan comes to this territory, they ruled only for several decades. It was a time of the rise of Central Asia. The trading was very developed, a lot of scientists and scholars worked in the cities, and the army was also big. When Genghis Khan turned his attention to Central Asia, the ruler of Khwarazm Shahs, it was Alauddin Muhammad. Well, you know, I must tell you that he was quite a mediocre ruler. So when Genghis Khan started to think about Central Asia, he firstly decided to build friendship between him and Khwarazm Shahs, and that's how he sent a group of envoys and ambassadors to the court of Khwarazm Shahs. But when that group of envoys came to Otrar, it's a city in the southern Kazakhstan, all of them were killed. And that was actually a big scandal, as in the culture of Mongols, ambassadors and envoys, they considered to be inviolable. And Genghis Khan, he actually sent another group of envoys, and he was demanding redress, but that group also was killed. And that's how it became clear that the war between Genghis Khan and Khwarezm Shahs is inevitable. The army of Muhammad was quite big. Some sources say that it had around 400,000 soldiers. Even for nowadays it's big. For that time it was just outstandingly big. But as I told you, Muhammad, he was actually quite a mediocre ruler, and all his generals and commanders, they were telling him that, oh, we need to give one decisive battle to Genghis Khan as our army outnumbers his. But Muhammad, he didn't want to listen to anything, and he actually decided to make a very stupid thing. He decided to divide his army and allocate them in the big cities as Bukhara, Samarkand, and some others. Muhammad thought that Mongols, being nomads, don't know anything about the siege techniques, or they don't know anything about the winning the cities with the high walls. But actually Muhammad was wrong, because by the time that Mongols came to Central Asia, they already had a military campaign in China, and from there they took a lot of engineers with different kind of equipment. The division of the army by Khwarezm Shah made it much easier for Genghis Khan to conquer Central Asia. The army of Genghis Khan was probably the most advanced in the world at that days, and usually when people think about the army of nomads, and Mongols were nomads obviously, they think about the big number of the archers. But actually when Genghis Khan finished his military campaign in China, he decided to reformate his army. For example, his people in the army, they were professional warriors. They were not peasants who fight from time to time. They were well trained and ready for any conditions. They moved fast, very often surprising their enemies by appearing unexpectedly or from the side no one expected them to. And each warrior had several horses, so when one horse was tired, the warrior could change that horse, and that's how not to decrease their speed. Plus, another technique what they were using their prisoners as their living shield. It was very cruel but quite effective, because, for example, the people from sieged cities, it was difficult for them to attack the army which was approaching, because in the first row they could see their brothers, sisters, mothers, and etc. Plus, they were using some unusual techniques to scare their enemies. Well, a lot of scholars think it's a legendary thing, but the others say that it's true. So when the army of Genghis Khan was approaching some place, the people could know it really in advance, and there was a very strong smell coming from that side. Well, you know, they were nomads, so of course they didn't take the shower very often, and Genghis Khan used that smell as a scaring technique for the people of the place he was about to conquer. Of course, the invasion of Genghis Khan, it was a catastrophe for Central Asia. Such cities as Bukhara and Samarkand were almost pulled down. And here I need to bring up some topic which always comes up when we talk about Mongols, that the Mongols, they were very cruel and they were killing all the people of the places that they were conquering. So let's clarify this statement. Yes, of course, I don't argue that Mongols killed thousands of people in Central Asia, in China, or later in Iran. But the thing is that if people of the siege city, they surrendered willingly, Mongols were not killing anyone and they were not destroying the places. Yes, Bukhara and Samarkand were destroyed, but only because they didn't want to surrender to the troops of Genghis Khan. For Mongols, it was much more practical to preserve the cities and people, as in the future they could make more money from them, as they were paying taxes and tributes. And Genghis Khan was not stupid. He wanted to have a prosperous state, not the empty cities and only dead people. Plus, he always protected the clergy. Like in Bukhara, for example, he gathered the representatives of the clergy in the main mosque, and he told them that you can keep following your religion, you just need not to scheme against the Mongols. And of course, such things really worked for the good reputation of the Mongols. In addition, Mongols were very tolerant, which was not typical for any part of the world at that time, because people of different religions were killing each other with big pleasure. But Mongols, they were not like that. They didn't care what religion you follow, Buddhist, Muslim, or maybe pagans. They didn't want you to change the religion into their religion. That was not the goal for Mongols. They themselves were not Christian or Muslim. They had their own religion, which was called Tengriism, and the main god was Tengri. We talked about Tengriism in our lecture about Turks, so check it out if you haven't seen it yet. When Mongols conquered Central Asia or China, they never tried to convert people into their religion. Again, about the situation with clergy in Bukhara, Genghis Khan, he was a smart man, and of course he knew that clergy controls the minds of people. If he shows mercy and didn't kill the priests, that could win people over to his side. Mongols wouldn't be able to understand Inquisition, which actually was a disaster for Europe of the Middle Ages. They wouldn't be able to understand why to kill people if they didn't want to accept your religion. And again, it was very good for the reputation of the Mongols, because at that time religion was the basis of the life of the people. Usually people were really scared that, oh my God, these Catholics, they will come and they will force us also to be Catholics. In general, very often people didn't care who would rule him. Just don't touch my religion and let me follow my worshipping practices. Another thing I should say about Genghis Khan, that he really recognized the loyalty. Very often he even liked that the person didn't want to betray his previous master and to take the side of Genghis Khan. For example, in Bukhara during the siege, several thousands of warriors from Samarkand, they took the side of Genghis Khan. And at first Genghis Khan, he pretended that, oh, he is really happy to accept their help. But when the city was conquered, he ordered to kill all that soldiers, because he said if they betrayed their own city, of course I cannot trust them. And even more, Genghis Khan sometimes could show mercy to his biggest enemies if they again didn't want to betray the previous master and take the side of Genghis Khan, because for Genghis Khan being loyal was the main thing in the man's character. Back to Khwarazm Shah Muhammad. So when he understood that he lost the war to Genghis Khan, he escaped his country, he went to one of the islands of the Caspian Sea and he died there. That's where the story of Muhammad Khwarazm Shah ends, but don't think that the war was over. No, locals kept on fighting against Genghis Khan, and we know some names of the local heroes. One of them was Timur Malik, who was from Khujand. Khujand is a city in the modern Tajikistan. Actually, it's ex-Alexandria Eskata, the city that was founded by Alexander the Great. When Mongols approached Khujand, Timur Malik, he didn't want to surrender, and that's how the siege of Khujand lasted for several months. And Timur Malik, for example, he was using a lot of guerrilla techniques, which were quite successful, but in the end, Genghis Khan and his troops, they managed to capture the city, and Timur Malik had to escape. He wasn't killed, and later he joined another very famous hero who fought against Genghis Khan, Jalaluddin Mangburni. Who was Jalaluddin Mangburni? Well, actually, he wasn't a stranger to this territory, and in fact, he was the son of Alauddin Muhammad, that Khwarazm Shah who fought so stupidly against Genghis Khan. After the death of his father, technically, Jalaluddin, he became the ruler of the empire of Khwarazm Shahs, which actually didn't exist at that time already. But Jalaluddin, he didn't want to surrender. He formed an army and he decided to fight against Genghis Khan. We know that the army of Genghis Khan consists of tens and tens of thousands of warriors. For example, in the siege of Bukhara and Samarkand took part about 110,000 people. Of course, the number of the army of Jalaluddin, it was much smaller, and the final battle between Jalaluddin and Genghis Khan, it happened at the banks of Indus, yes, far away from the territories of Central Asia, and Jalaluddin, he lost because the army of Genghis Khan outnumbered his army, but he himself, he wasn't killed. He managed to escape and he ran to the territories of modern Iran, Iraq and Azerbaijan. For around 10 years, he was roaming around that territories, claiming himself to be and considering himself to be the descendant of the great empire, and he always hoped to reconstruct the land of his ancestors. Finally, he was killed in 1231, but still in the local history, these two people, Timur Malik and Jalal Mangburni, they are remembered like local heroes who were fighting against the invaders, against Genghis Khan. In 1221, when Genghis Khan defeated Jalal Mangburni and he got all Central Asia under his control, he decided to come back home to Mongolia, and he was actually quite old, especially for that time. He was in his 60s, plus don't forget how hard his life was, and he died in 1227, but before he died, he divided his state between his four sons. He had four sons, and the second son, Chagatai, got the bigger part of Central Asia. At the time of its peak, the ulus, or the state of Chagatai, it included the parts of Altai, it's modern Russia, also western parts of China, modern Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and also parts of Kazakhstan. But in general, the rulers of Chagatai dynasties, they were not so interested in the lands of Central Asia, and they even moved the capital from here to the eastern Kazakhstan. Basically, the descendants of Chagatai, they farmed out the territories of Central Asia to Khwarazmian merchant Mahmud Yalavaj, and he and his relatives, they ruled in this territory for several decades, only sending tax and tributaries to the capital of the ulus. Together with Genghis Khan, to Central Asia came a lot of Mongolian tribes, and some of them, they decided not to come back together with Genghis Khan to Mongolia. They started to live here, and slowly they assimilated with the local population. They accepted Islam by the end of the 14th century, and also they were already talking Turkic, not Mongolian language. They became the part of the local society, and no one was thinking about them as newcomers. That's how they became the part of Central Asia. Only when Quebec, the descendant of Chagatai dynasty, became the ruler, he had some interest in this region and he decided to imply some reforms. For example, he implemented administrative reform to change the management of these lands, but unfortunately he didn't rule for a long time. He was killed in 1326. After that, on the territory of Central Asia started a kind of the civil war, the internal strifes between the descendants of Chagatai and the local dynasties. And finally, in 1340, the ulus of Chagatai, it fell into two pieces: Mongolistan, which was Kyrgyzstan and Western Kazakhstan, and Maveranahar, which is the center of Central Asia. After that, the territory of Maveranahar fell into even smaller states, smaller pieces. In 1346, the ruler of Samarkand became Kazagan. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan or Chagatai, and that's how he was called Amir, not Khan. Kazagan was a powerful military commander who originally served under the rule of Chagatai dynasty, but when the power of Chagatai dynasty weakened due to internal strife and economical problems, he took this chance to become the real ruler himself. He didn't completely abolish the dynasty of Chagatai, but for some years he had like a fake puppet Khan for legitimacy, but the real power, of course, it all belonged to him. And his title Emir, it means that he ruled by military strength, not by dynasty right. The shift marked the beginning of the pattern which became quite widespread in Central Asia, when military leaders becoming kingmakers or even the rulers themselves, even they were not from the royal bloodlines. The son of Kazagan, Abdullah, tried to keep the power after his death, but unfortunately he wasn't strong enough, and that's how his weakness opened the door for the appearing of the next ambitious leader, Timur, or as you probably know him, Tamerlane. He would rise out of the chaos that followed Kazagan's death. By this time, the region was really politically fragmented, and such places as Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, and Khiva were ruled by the representatives of local dynasties or military commanders. Yes, the trade was still working, but with much more difficulty, as all these local rulers, they wanted to collect their own taxes or tolls from the caravans. Plus, nomadic tribes, they started to attack some territories of these lands, taking advantage of the weakness of its rulers and commanders. This was really the time of short-lived alliances, betrayals, and losses. In the end of this lecture, I would like to say that the invasion of Mongols had a very big impact on the life of the people of Central Asia. Yes, Mongols came here, they assimilated with locals, but at the same time they brought a lot of the new things with them. The Mongol conquest really became a turning point. On one hand, of course, it brought a destruction and a huge people loss, especially in the first wave of conquering. Such cities as Balkh, Merv or Nishapur were completely wiped out. Libraries were burned, irrigational systems were destroyed, and entire neighborhood vanished. On the other hand, as soon as Mongol Empire settled, it created one of the most peaceful and unified periods in Central Asian history, so-called Pax Mongolica. The peace allowed the trade to flourish again. For example, the paper money started to be used more widely. The cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, they were rebuilt and started to thrive again. The Mongols brought with them not only the military power, but also engineers, new management, and the knowledges from all around the empire. Techniques in metallurgy, military strategy, medicine, and even astronomy spread all around Central Asia. As for Yassa, Genghis Khan legal code, it wasn't written down as the modern laws, but it was followed almost religiously. Even centuries later, after the death of Genghis Khan, the local rulers used it for solving the disputes or ruling their courts, especially among nomads. And the figure of Genghis Khan also remained powerful. Even when the later ruler had nothing with him by blood, they still tried to copy his example, like Tamerlane, the hero of our next lecture. He wasn't a descendant of Genghis Khan, but he married into a Mongol royal family and was claiming that he's restoring the legacy of Genghis Khan. Even more, his entire political image was constructed around the idea of being the next Genghis Khan. Even in the 19th and 20th century, people all around Central Asia still respected his legacy, his strategies, his laws, even his attitude towards religion and tolerance left a lasting imprint on the local history. If you like this lecture, please comment, share, like, and follow us so you won't miss our next lectures.